So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Collins, and I'm the Director General of the IIEA, the Institute of International and European Affairs. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this IIEA webinar. And we're absolutely thrilled, delighted to be joined today by Professor Stephen Walt from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, who has been generous enough to take time out to speak to us this morning, American time, this afternoon, Irish time. Professor Walt will speak to us on the topic of the world order after the pandemic. I think he'll be arguing that COVID-19 will have lasting implications for world politics even after the pandemic is finally over. And we certainly look forward to hearing his analysis and insights on all of this. Professor Walt will talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will go to Q&A with you, our audience, in the usual way, and you'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screen. Please also feel free to send your questions in throughout the session as they occur to you, and we will come to them once Professor Walt has finished his presentation. A reminder that today's presentation and Q&A are both on the record. You've already seen the information on Professor Walt, but just to recap, he is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in May 2005 and received the International Studies Association's Distinguished Senior Scholar Award in 2014. He has many, many books, of course, to his name. His books include The Origins of Alliances, which received the 1988 Elgar S. Furness National Security Book Award, Revolution and War and Taming American Power, The Global Response to US Primacy, which was a finalist for the Lionel Gelber International Affairs Book Award, and Arthur Ross Book Prize. His book, The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy, co-authored with John Mearsheimer, was, of course, a New York Times bestseller and has been translated into more than 20 foreign languages. I'll have to check with him to see whether Gaelic is one of those, but we'll see. In any event, his latest book is The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of US Primacy. So quite a rich harvest there of material from which I'm sure he will be drawing. But in any event, Stephen, you're very, very welcome to Dublin. We wish you were here in person at some time again in the future. I'm sure you will be. But in the meantime, the floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you very much. I certainly wish I was there in person myself. I have fond memories of my 2 visits to Ireland. As we talked yesterday, I can't claim Irish ancestry, but I did start my day with a large bowl of authentic Irish oatmeal. So I'm trying to at least be there in spirit if I can't be there in person. So my topic today is the world order after COVID, after the pandemic, and this is inherently a little speculative. There's lots we still don't know. We still don't know how long the current experience we're in is going to last. But I do think a number of things are clear, a number of trends we can forecast forward, and there's some things that about the future world order, I'll be somewhat surprised if they don't come true, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So as usual with Zoom, I'm going to share my screen now and put up some slides, which I hope are going to be visible in a second. And let's see here. All right, I hope that's all visible to all of you. So here's the basic outline of what I'll be going through. I'll summarize the main arguments, describe some of the things that were happening in the world before the pandemic, discuss the immediate results, most of which you are all aware of, and then lay out some of my ideas on where we're headed. That we're going to see a less open world than would have existed otherwise, a world that is less free, less democratic than we might have expected, that the United States in particular is going to be more adversely affected than a number of other countries, not in terms of the absolute damage or suffering, but in terms of our relative position in the world. And then I'll say some general remarks about the future global order that this will produce. So my main arguments are as follows. First of all, COVID-19 is not going to alter the basic nature of world politics. It's not going to transform everything. We're not going to see some kind of world government emerge out of all of this. The nation state will remain the basic building block of world politics, and those states are going to continue to compete for power and influence, much as they have for centuries. However, the pandemic is accelerating several trends that were already underway before COVID struck us all, and intensifying their impact. And in particular, I think it's going to reinforce the gradual shift in power and wealth we have seen toward Asia, and lead to a world that is less open and less free than it would have been otherwise. So let me talk about some of the things that were happening before COVID occurred. First of all, we were seeing the end of what you might call the unipolar moment, that era where the United States really stood alone atop the pinnacle of world power, roughly from the early 1990s until perhaps 2010, 2012. This has been produced by a number of things. Obviously, the rise of China, the partial recovery of Russia, some of the mistakes that the United States made, the war in Iraq, for example. All of those have led to the reemergence of some familiar patterns of great power competition. And I think we're seeing that happen more and more already. This was taking place before the pandemic. We were also seeing a gradual shift in power and wealth from the West back to the East. And I don't want to overstate this. The United States, Europe, and other countries still remain very wealthy, very powerful. It's not like suddenly Asia has gone into the lead. But the trend line was clearly one away from complete sort of Western domination of the world system to one where power was going to be more evenly distributed. Third, we'd seen a global backlash against what I might call hyper-globalization. You see this in the Brexit decision by the United Kingdom, backing away from the European Union, trade wars in various contexts, the decoupling of the US-Chinese economy, populist opposition in various places to immigration and refugees. Already this was happening before COVID struck. And another trend, of course, that was going on was increased authoritarianism. According to the think tank Freedom House, 2019 was the 13th consecutive year in which global freedom had declined. We've also seen movements away from democracy in places like Poland, Hungary, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, and a number of other countries. The bottom line here is even before the pandemic began, the world was becoming less open, less free, and less dominated by the West. What have been COVID's immediate impact? Well, first of all, as of yesterday, we've had over 33 million confirmed cases worldwide, approximately 35,000 in Ireland, by the way. And that number is probably an underestimate across the board, and of course is still going up. We've now cleared over 1 million confirmed deaths due to COVID, approximately 1,800 in Ireland. And that number is almost certain, in fact, certainly will rise for some time to come. The International Monetary Fund has projected that the world economy is going to contract by about 5% in 2020. Ireland is going to be a little bit above the trend line there. Its economy expected to shrink by about 6.5%. And the International Labor Organization forecast a couple of months ago that nearly half the global workforce is at risk of having its livelihood destroyed. So the economic impact of this pandemic is non-trivial indeed. To deal with this, governments are doing a variety of emergency measures, which of course requires taking on lots of debt. So you see debt levels soaring in many countries, which could have a long-term effect on economic productivity. And the bottom line here is, although a few months ago people were hoping we might see a very rapid recovery if the pandemic proves short-lived, it's increasingly likely now we're not going to see what some call a V-shaped recovery, a sharp decline and then a sharp recovery economically. It's much more likely to be a rather gradual one. So what's that going to produce? Well, first of all, this is leading to a less open world, one where borders are going to start mattering more. COVID-19 already revealed that there were some risks to integrated supply chains, these tightly linked economic production lines that we've seen as one feature of globalization. It was clear before COVID that those supply chains were at risk when you started to get a trade war. So that was happening even before the pandemic. But of course, the pandemic has simply driven this home more powerfully, that suddenly when you have to shut things down because of disease, that affects an entire economic production line. The result of this is that both countries and firms are looking to diversify their supplies, increase their stockpiles, and try and bring more production at home as a matter of sort of financial or economic prudence. And you'll see I quote there William Buiter, he's the former chief economist at Citigroup, with a nice line that just-in-time economics will give way to just-in-case economics with multiple supply chains to ensure continuity in a crisis. This is going to be less economically efficient, so lower economic growth, but perhaps more robust to uncertainty, such as a future pandemic. COVID-19 also, of course, has shown us the risk of allowing people to move freely from country to country, as we all used to enjoy doing. Foreign travel's been severely restricted. That's why I'm here on Zoom as opposed to present there in Dublin. And I think that the fear of future infections is likely to reinforce xenophobia, forms of racism, as states are likely to maintain new barriers to travel and migration even after the pandemic is over. It's not that we won't go back to the world just as it was in 2017 or 2018. You should be ready once we start traveling again to have various restrictions placed on you once you get to wherever it is you're going. I also think we're discovering a lot can be accomplished online, so there's going to be less business travel, less movement of people in the future because people have learned that maybe some of that's unnecessary. We'll just add one point here. It's a reminder that the coronavirus that causes this disease is the latest in a series of viruses. We've had AIDS, we've had SARS, we've had Middle East respiratory syndrome, and we've had Ebola. All of these have happened in the last 25 or 30 years. Once COVID-19 is over, it's not the last one of these we're going to see. And one big question will be whether or not the world is better prepared the next time this comes around. And I'll say a word or two about that at the end. It's also likely to be a less free world. In any kind of an emergency, governments start limiting personal freedoms, start imposing restrictions on civil liberties, government control goes up. In wartime, we have censorship of the press. Governments take control of the economy. They impose greater secrecy on others. And of course, we've seen exactly this thing happen in response to the pandemic. Lockdowns, shutting down businesses, increased surveillance, mandatory testing in some countries, tracking and tracing in democracies and dictatorships alike. Again, it's why I can't be there in Ireland, because it's illegal for me to go there now. In some countries, leaders have requested and obtained emergency powers to deal with this. They may give them back when it's all over, they may not. And I would add here that the record so far between democracies and dictatorships is a mixed. Regime type doesn't seem to be determining success or failure. You have some democracies like New Zealand that have done very, very well in responding to this. You have other democracies like the United States or the United Kingdom that have handled this very badly. And the same is true for dictatorships. There are some authoritarian governments that have actually reacted very well. There's other dictatorships that have handled it badly as well. The bottom line here is many restrictions are likely to be lifted once this is over, but not all of them. And some of those restrictions may not have that much to do with public health. This is a great opportunity for some authoritarian governments to, put an app to track you on your phone, keep track of all your contacts. It's all being done in the name of preventing the spread of a disease, but those tracking abilities may still be there long after this is over. So a less free world as well. Let me say a little bit about the United States. The United States still has enormous advantages. It will remain a very powerful country, but one impact that this has had on us is I think our reputation for competence has been badly damaged by how badly the United States has handled this. We were supposed to be a country that respected science, had marvelous technical capabilities, had an enormous healthcare establishment, should have been able to do a much better job than we had. And I think the reputation of the United States for simply as a country that knows how to get things done has been badly harmed by this. We've also are seeing business bankruptcies in lots of countries, including the United States. And the more companies go out of business, the slower the recovery is likely to be, because a company can't rehire workers if it's already gone bankrupt, if it's already gone out of business. Moreover, the long-term effects on education, I think, still remain to be seen, but are not going to be good. Schools are closed or operating in a partial fashion all over the United States and in other countries. That means less educational progress. That means a less well-trained workforce 10 or 20 years down the road, which means less economic productivity. Another feature here is once you lock things down, once people aren't going to their businesses, you have problems at home. You have increased spousal abuse, increased child abuse, which means over time, you're going to have greater long-term mental health issues as well. And finally, there's some very interesting scientific evidence suggesting that when women are pregnant, if they're undergoing high levels of stress, this actually has long-term effects on the health, educational prospects of their children. The fetus is actually affected by what the mother is going through in all sorts of ways that have quite distinct and measurable negative consequences. Now, my point here is that all countries going through this pandemic are going to be experiencing these problems, but the relative impact will be greatest the longer the pandemic endures in a particular country. And I think this is a problem for the United States, for the United Kingdom, and some others, because instead of having a problem here for 1 or 2 or 3 months and then getting a handle on it, this is going on for months and is likely to continue for some time to come. So the relative impact for some countries of these long-term trends is likely to be greater. All right, so where does this lead the world order? Well, nationalism, great power competition were increasing before the pandemic occurred. Nationalism never really went away, although I think some people hoped that it had. And we've seen a resurgence of great power rivalry even before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, despite lots of incentives to cooperate, most states have actually gone it alone in response. The United States, of course, has now announced it's going to cut off funding to the World Health Organization. Russia, China, the United States, and India all declined to participate in the European Union's Vaccine Research Fund. In general, states have sought to protect their own national vaccine research efforts so that they get access to a vaccine first. And of course, we've also seen some governments, most notably China and the United States, basically trying to blame each other for the problem. In this sense, you haven't seen a sudden outpouring of global cooperation in response to a global problem. There are some exceptions to this. The European Union did put together an unprecedented rescue fund. But overall, I think it's been sort of every state for itself more than anything else. And meanwhile, while all this is happening, conflicts are continuing in places like Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, between India and China now, Sudan, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and lots of other places as well. So in that sense, international politics has not really changed at all. So where do I think this leads us? First, the post-pandemic world will be defined primarily by what was already emerging beforehand, and that's the growing rivalry between the United States and China, especially in Asia. I can say more about this in response to the questions, but I think the simple answer here is China would like to have, at a minimum, a dominant position in Asia. That doesn't mean expanding and conquering Asia, just a position where it is the principal power there and doesn't fear its neighbors any longer. And the United States is likely to try to prevent that, which means there's going to be a competition for influence in Asia between the United States and China, and that's going to lead to a pretty intense rivalry. The European Union, meanwhile, is going to be preoccupied with all sorts of internal and regional issues. About 2 weeks ago, the EU Foreign Minister, Borrell, made a speech announcing that Europe must chart its own way to avoid being squeezed between the United States and China. I understand that sentiment, but Europe is not likely to be able to remain neutral between the two major powers and still expect American protection in the context of NATO. I think that's going to be an impossible bargain. We perhaps may want to say more about that in the future. And of course, Europe will be worried primarily about issues in its own neighborhood, whether it's what's happening in North Africa, in Ukraine, elsewhere in the Middle East, the growing rivalry between Greece and Turkey. So the EU will still be a major player, but may be punching below its weight because it's so preoccupied with internal issues. Russia, in my view, will continue to decline relative to the other powers. I always like to remind people that the Russian economy is smaller than Italy's, and that puts real limits on Russian influence, but it will still have some, particularly in areas close to its own borders. And as I said before, overall power and influence is going to be shifting in the direction of Asia, just as it was before the pandemic. If I were to add one more point to this slide, is perhaps the biggest uncertainty in the short term, of course, is what course the United States is going to follow. And that's going to depend very heavily on what happens about a month from now in our election. So my last slide here. There are, despite what I've just suggested about a world of sort of growing rivalry between the United States and China, one where conflicts continue in a number of places, and where countries may be forced to line up, and pick a side between the two major powers, there are some areas where the major powers must continue to cooperate, or in an ideal world they would, and that includes the US and China. First and most obviously, cooperation to end the current pandemic and prevent future ones is clearly necessary. The one silver lining here is there has been a considerable amount of information exchange and cooperation among the scientific community, transnationally or internationally. Scientists are sharing information pretty well. That's the one sort of bright spot I can point to here. There is no guarantee, however, that we will develop better global responses or better national responses. Historically, the tendency has been to sort of overreact to an emergency like this, do a lot of smart things for a few years, and then gradually become complacent and relax, and then get surprised all over again. Let's hope that we are a little bit wiser going forward. Other issues, another obvious one is climate change. It cannot be solved if you don't get reasonable cooperation and agreements between the major greenhouse gas producers, China, India, the United States, most of industrial Europe as well. Progress had been made until relatively recently. The United States, I think, now has been the sticking point. That's again why November matters. Improving nuclear security. It's in the interest of all the major powers that nuclear weapons be kept under very reliable control, not used in anger as well. We have, I think, a shared interest there. I think it's increasingly clear that the World Trade Organization is in need of radical reform. We're going to need some kind of rules and arrangements to govern the global economy. The WTO is showing its age, some clear problems there. But creating a new set of rules to handle global trade and investment is going to be essential, and again requires agreement among the major powers. It's, I think, also increasingly clear that the digital world, for all of the benefits we get from it, has a dark side to it, and developing some norms of conduct for what states and private actors can do, how social media should be allowed to operate, is another area where we would be much better off if we can reach agreements than if it's every country for itself. So my bottom line here, and it's where I'll stop, is that the biggest challenge we're likely to face is to preserve all of the places where we can benefit from cooperation in a post-COVID world, but to do that in an era where there's going to be rising competition, probably greater suspicion, and an emerging rivalry between the most powerful states. Let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions.